This series of lunchtime conversations intends to capture insights from some of society's thought leaders, given the unprecedented times we are living in. The 4th of June, and my penultimate guest in the lunchtime series is Paul Horton. He's the Chief Exec of the Future Waters Association. Part of my role at Warwick University is to make sure our programmes remain relevant and continue to serve the needs of society. To do this, it's really important that I am part of the research and industry community. The people I've been speaking to in this series form my professional network, and I rely on them to inform and help steer our educational offerings. We've seen seismic shifts in all areas of life. The extraordinarily pervasive nature of COVID-19 will have lasting effects. So, Paul, welcome to lunch. Can I start?
Pleased to be here.
So, albeit virtually. Can I start by asking you to tell me a little bit about the mission of the Future Waters Association and its relationship with kind of water companies in the UK?
Yes, certainly. So the association brings together suppliers across the industry, and the suppliers are there to engage with a combination of themselves and the water companies. And really our mission is quite straightforward. We believe that there should be a connected, engaged, innovative workforce. Our focus is around innovation, but it's around collaboration and how to make the most effective use of people's knowledge, IP, etc., in order to make the industry not just world leading, but work for everybody, for the utilities, the suppliers, for catchment management, for the customers. And we believe we're at the heart of that because water's at the heart of how the climate's changing, and we've seen that just in the past 3 or 4 months.
Mm. I spoke to Courtney earlier this week, and Courtney works for National Grid, from the energy, so another utilities, and she was explaining about the relationship between, I think it was Ofgem and the private company National Grid. And is water, is it structured in the same way, or what's the differences do you see, or is it just a different industry altogether?
No, it's similar in many ways. Obviously, you're talking about something being moved across a pipe network. I don't know the figures in terms of the gas industry, but water sector has about 350,000 kilometres of water mains across England and Wales, as an example, and somewhere in the region of 640,000 linked to sewers and drains. So it's massive in that context. Structure-wise, the similarities are that industry has Ofgem, we have Ofwat. Ofwat is the economic regulator for the water industry and has just done the latest price review. Each price review lasts for a 5-year period. But perhaps where things differ is the water industry also has the regulators, the drinking water inspectorate that tests all the water that comes through our taps, does an audit process on the water companies,
Okay.
and also test products that come into contact with potable stroke drinking water. And then the Environment Agency, which regulates the industry in terms of discharges to the environment, but equally important at the moment, abstracts from the environment as well in terms of water use.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, okay. So some overlaps there in the sort of general structure, but maybe a little bit more point of consumption checking that seems to happen maybe in the water industry to for quality and for the waste that we might produce. And from the water perspective, we saw shocking reports from other countries of people not having running water to wash their hands, and when the coronavirus was rapidly spreading. That didn't happen in the UK, I don't think, or it didn't. Why not? I mean, we saw this in developing and developed countries. We saw them having problems with many people not having running water just to wash their hands. We're developed, the other countries were developed. Why didn't we have the same problems? What's different about what we do?
I think it's the easy answer is to say the way we're connected. So most, if not all, of the population is connected to water supply, and most of that is mains. Sometimes it's borehole, but it's all quality checked and assured, and because of that, the issue becomes how much water can you get into supply, as opposed to people not having access. Don't get me wrong, there may be the odd burst, which means, you know, groups of houses and places that don't have access to water for a very short term, but the population's got access to it, so we can turn the taps on and therefore wash as and when we need to. I'm not saying that doesn't represent its own challenges. Some of the figures I've seen in the past week suggest that an extra 2.25 billion litres of water have been used daily, particularly because
See,
the spring. Yeah. But well, the springs. This spring has had 660 hours of sunshine, and the previous record in the 1920s was 550 something. So that plus the warm weather has meant a lot more usage of water, in addition to extra washing of hands. So what does that look like? As well, it's probably about 900 Olympic swimming pools a
gosh.
day extra. So that's been where more of the pressure has come from. How do you get hold of that water and put it through the treatment plants? The
Hmm.
challenge is often the volume that can go through the treatment plants to meet the wider demand, and obviously that demand has come from people as
I
industries
mean,
have been initially closed.
that's
Yeah.
fascinating because, I guess from the energy usage, the demand has really it's dropped. I think it was 25%, Courtney said, and the demand has
Mhm.
dropped because industry hasn't been operating. So with industry shutting down, um, energy usage went down. It's really, I think,
Yeah.
it's surprising to hear how much water usage has actually gone up, even although industry has closed down. So it's domestic
Yeah.
use that is, does it put the most demand on the supply of water, or is there an equal split? How, or do you, is that not a figure? Like, how does it, do you understand
Yeah.
agricultural demand, industry
Yeah.
demand, domestic, and what does that, how does
Yeah.
it split?
Well, probably as a country, you have so it's interesting what you said about, sorry, just a slight side for Courtney, because
Mm,
the figures suggest the increase in water has gone up by 20%, possibly up to
gosh.
25%. So there's been that, you know, energy's gone down, water's gone up, but you can, the difference being that by and large the biggest pull on water usage is from domestic. You know, even agriculture probably only accounts for about 20%, 25% maximum. So the biggest use is domestic. You know, as I mentioned, we're connected across the whole country. I can't remember off the top of my head how many millions of households that is, but you
Mm,
factor in all those households, and that's where the bulk has come from. The warm weather, where we've been at times up to 10 degrees temperature higher than normal, has meant that people have used paddling pools because they're at home. You know,
mm,
as an example, they've watered
yes.
their gardens, they've done it because a lot of people have been homebound, so they've done a lot more of that. Some of the figures I've also seen suggest that dishwashers and washing machines have been used more, um, in part because people are at home, in part because of how people are thinking about things like the virus and the impact. So I think there's a lot of factors that have jumped in, and the usual thing of everyone's having a cup of tea at certain times of the day. They finish the Zoom calls, you know, it's
Mm.
6 o'clock, boom, and they're not travelling home. So between 6 and 10, you see some quite sharp peaks in demand, as well. So there's all of those factors that the positives that have come out of this are exactly what you said. We've been able to supply water across the population. The water companies are being classed as key workers, their staff. Equally, the supply chain works with the water companies to deliver probably anywhere up to three-quarters of the projects that water companies work on. So the supply chain has been there helping to ensure that the pipes are quickly mended,
Yeah.
if there's any burst, you know, things are tackled. There hasn't been the level of traffic on the road, so that's been easier. And ironically, understanding your baseline of water consumption, which the industry tends to talk about as the nightline levels, you know, the point at which no other things are happening. They've been able to collect a lot more data around that, which should help with water supply, dealing with leakage better, etc. So there's various things that have emerged that have allowed us to be more creative, I suppose, and collect better data and do things in a different way.
Yes, yeah, and do the water companies share that data from one area to another, or it is a private, it's a private companies? Do they compete, or I mean they must compete necessarily being private, but how do they
Mm.
share, and how what level of sharing of data do they do?
There's there's probably more sharing than people realise. I mean, if you look at something like leakage, there's a lot of work being done to develop what's called leakage hotspot maps, as in where some of the more creative work is being done and shared. The private in England, Wales is owned through a trust, so the public own it in Wales. Obviously, Scottish Waters, a public entity. So, and they're all talking about innovations and ideas and where they need to focus and what the priorities are. And we as an association run an event looking at networks every year, in both the water mains and the sewer networks. There's huge amounts of data sharing taking place there because you need to understand the health of the asset. And some of these assets have been in the ground for since the 1900s, you know, the early 1900s. So you've got to understand all of that. So there's a lot going on, and I think there's more cooperation in the past few months, more understanding, and equally, there's been an ironic push towards more uh, remote use of systems, remote monitoring, use of drones, you know, other things
Yes.
that perhaps were slowly coming into the industry and the sector. We've seen in 3 or 4 months that we can make much more use of these than we actually do.
Mm. Yeah, yes, okay. So, yeah, independent, competitive, but yet quite a lot of sharing between the different companies is what I'm going to take from that. And again,
Absolutely.
and as we look forward, this 20% drop, has that happened? How big is agriculture? How big is the demand of agriculture, and how much the waste from agriculture from water? How significant is that? Is that a large part of the water industry?
It's you know, I mentioned earlier, it's probably less than 25% of total use comes from agriculture. I think a lot of agriculture's got more efficient. Yeah, there are still some spray irrigation systems, but they've got a lot better about water usage. The the bigger targets that are emerging around how the land itself is looked after, how land management. That's not just down to fertilizers. There's a much broader spread about how land use can impact more widely on catchments, and there's some great collective work being done there. You know, as well, one example has been Wessex Water have been working with the Environment Agency to see how they look at managing a whole catchment and how you would issue a permit that covered the whole catchment in terms of the environmental management, water quality, etc. And that's really exciting, and that brings everyone together: people, agriculture, industry, all of it. So
Mm.
it's becoming much more interesting, and I think the past few months have done a couple of things. One of which is huge numbers are working remotely,
Yes.
where we all now have Zoom as part of our vocabulary, as well as MS Teams, as well as whatever it may
Yes.
be. Um, and what we found is that actually we can we can work, we can do things in a different way, and decision making in some areas has speeded up rapidly. And I think all of that is quite exciting because it's pointing towards, yes, things will evolve, and this is all changing, but actually we can use remote in a way that we never thought we could, and
Yeah.
that's one of the exciting things, and that changes the potential dynamic of how we manage catchments, water systems, how we understand underground water as well as reservoirs as well as rivers. How we understand all the interactions there across industry. I mean, the data that must exist now in relation to wider industrial use as well as domestic
Yes.
is is things we can never have imagined collecting.
Yeah, yeah. I
In,
mean, it's quite in a way, as much as we have survived this pandemic, there is an element of there's an element of being hopeful about our ability to. Everybody knows all the systems are interconnected, and I feel maybe now there's more confidence to say, well, we might not know it all, but we are able to make an attempt to understand that connectivity between all these big systems and social, economic, political, and technical, and bring them all together to without and that we are able to do it rather than maybe, well, that's very complex and maybe we shan't try to tackle all of
yeah,
that because it's too much. So I think there's an element of hopefulness there. I think as well. I think I can see that there's opportunities
yeah.
to consider these big systems. Mm, yeah. And
Absolutely, and I think one of the interesting things is the regulator Ofwat has been looking at the benefits of an innovation fund and how it could support doing
mhm,
things different in the water sector, bringing forward projects that may not have been part of the price review process. Um, and their focus has been on transformational, and I think the sector recognises, transformational as being the right way forward. Um, and nobody's really known how to define that. What does that mean? What does that look like? Is there a framework of understanding? And you go back 3 months and fast forward 3 months, and what's happened has been transformational. We've got a ready-made example sitting there,
yes.
um, and it brings all the things into play that you said. The whole systems thinking, and I'm personally a huge fan of systems thinking. I think we need it in this country in a much more focused way and in a way that drives policy rather than policy being political. I think we need systems thinking, and then it brings all the bits together. It brings transport, it brings IT, it brings rail, it brings war. I mean, rail has an interesting aspect in that one of their biggest challenges away from putting all the track in place is making sure that water doesn't affect the tracks. Drainage is a big issue in rail. So
Mm,
pull it all together, as much as it is in roads. So you can start to interface all of these and say,
yes.
well, how do we manage these differently and can we do it? And yes, we can. We've got examples of making much better use of IT systems now. So we can do it. Whereas I agree with you, we would have said that might take 4 or 5 years and
Mm,
it's going to rely on Microsoft doing something different or
yes.
Google. Well, actually, it doesn't. We've
Mm,
got the systems now. We can and we're showing how they can work together. I mean, MS Teams can interface with Zoom. So
yes.
we can all start to do things in a much more interesting way.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes, I think
so
so. I think so. So, um, yeah, I mean, you are Futures Water Association, so I think that's it
the
is. It's
future.
a hopeful and interesting look forward. I think as well. I mean, the water system, from my sort of layperson's experience, that's obviously reliant on water for life. Um, you know, I don't recall going and not having a water supply when I turned the tap. I don't recall. Um, maybe a million years ago when I had a burst pipe, when I was little. But I don't. It's something that um, you,
Yeah,
you the way we provide water in the UK is now so good that it doesn't come up onto it doesn't get into your vision. It doesn't, raise its head for you to witness it not being good and then being fixed. It just delivers all the time, which I think is probably it's probably a strength and a weakness because it's a super interesting and fascinating area. But then because it isn't noticed or advertised particularly, then it doesn't get that kind of acknowledgement of the excellent systems that are in place. Yeah. And what about your personal life? I mean, are you working from home? Is that what I'm looking at? Do you get to go out and about or?
yes. Working from home currently, I'm making use of the dining room table, and I'm trying to find ways to increase the Wi-Fi capacity in the property. It's a townhouse in a conservation area in just north of Kent, just in the northern part of Kent. And it's old, built in the 1900s. In fact, you may or may not be able to see
Ah,
the picture.
lovely. Yes.
That was where I live in 1900.
Yeah.
So it's that classic style, bigger bricks thing, and it's proved a Wi-Fi challenge. Is the one thing to emerge. But we work from home, and as an association, we've got about 140, 150 company members as an organisation. We made a decision probably a couple of years ago to move towards being able to work anywhere. So if everything went down in the building that we occupy, we could go and sit in the coffee shop was our original objective and just carry on working. So in some ways, the final element of that we put in place right at the beginning of this year. I'd love to say I had this amazing hindsight and I'd worked it all out. I'd looked at the business disruption of the association if X and Y happened. I didn't. We just had an objective that we could rely on ourselves and we didn't need a huge big server or anything like that.
Yes.
So it's been a smoothish transition. I suppose the bigger challenge is always people. So we've got regular connections, and I talk to the team and the staff, and we've been also working out what things we do for the members. So on the one aspect, it's talking to them about what things that are happening across the sector that we know, bringing in some experts where it makes sense. But equally, members who are used to selling, because their products, valves, actuators, whatever it may be, um, they're suddenly in a different world. So we've been running sessions on LinkedIn, how to use LinkedIn
Yeah.
almost as a surrogate to your normal face-to-face thing. How does that work? What does business disruption look like? And it's not just about the disruption; it's the recovery aspect of it. We ran a session this morning, actually, just before this call on remote working, all different aspects of that. And I got one of the members to come on board and share their knowledge of not just remote working because they do software as a service, but how they've implemented two projects virtually,
Mm.
just to say, look, you can do this. And one of those projects involved trying to get 25 engineers in a room, which they said, had we tried to get them all together to talk through the project work, would have been 3 months and 6 months, and we got them all together within a week. So we've been trying to do all of those. So it's good for the company, but also good for people. A couple of weeks ago was mental health awareness and a week, and I think these things shouldn't be weeks. They should be just part of what we do and
Yes.
understand, and that's a big aspect. And also for me, we surely now with the whole sector's in a position to have a different, better conversation with what we term the customer. And I say term the customer because if you're a supplier, you're a customer to the war in the companies, just as much as the domestic population. Well, surely now we can engage better.
Yes.
Our stakeholder meetings can be as inclusive as we need them to be,
Mm.
and we can talk to everyone. Bit of me's going, have we become more democratic because we're just talking like
Yeah.
this? We're not, you
Mm.
know, and I'm hopeful for that because I think that's an
Yeah,
important
I
part
see
of
a huge,
it.
there is, I mean, again and again and again, there seems to be this decentralization of power, of decision making, and people working more democratically and more autonomously, as long as they have access, so there's still that issue around protecting access and really being inclusive of the
Yeah,
wider community. Um, Yet there are so many examples of what good can look like from this that I think it's a more meaningful way to live, isn't it? I mean, it's a more meaningful existence, I think. It's
yeah, yeah,
there's more ownership and more ownership and autonomy in your own actions. So hmm,
yeah, and personally more valuable as a result. So
mhm.
I like to think, your point there, diversity and equality has changed. So you don't sit in a face-to-face meeting where someone dominates, perhaps, and people who want to have a view don't feel they can have a view. You don't sit in meetings where, through no fault of the building itself, it doesn't really have facilities to support disabled access. Well, it doesn't matter now, does it? Because we can communicate in
Yes.
these ways. I think that's hugely and potentially very positive. And we we did a blog as an association, and one of the things we said was that we hope the best of what's happened is taken forward,
Mm.
because that really demonstrate, a lot of change taking place in the industry. And what we just talked about, I think, is part of the best of what's been happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Paul, thank you very much indeed for sharing these insights with me. They are enormously valuable, and they give me insights not just to the sector of water and the way it's structured, but that the changing work environment, the changing society that you and I are here to serve. Um, so they are enormously useful. It makes me think about, if I'm creating education programs for people to go through, or learning environments or learning experiences, then this is the world that they're coming into. And yeah, it's a hopeful place to come into. Any students that might be overhearing this conversation, they can use this. They can use this material as secondary data, and it can help inform their research. And it's just very valuable to inform and build the wider Warwick community. If anybody listening wants to hear more from Paul, then drop me a line and I'll forward it on. I'm on Warwick's website, and if you're watching this on YouTube, follow the link on the closing slide. The series will also be made available as a podcast, so just search Insights Over Lunch on your preferred listening platform. And Paul, thank you very much for sharing with me, and I guess enjoy your lunch.
Yes, I'm not sure what I'm going to have yet, but that's one of the exciting things, isn't it?
Yes,
See what I'm doing.
thank you.